Hello students, and welcome back to Political Science 1513.W1 American Federal Government Online. Once again, I am your professor, Connor Alford, and in this video we're going to begin our discussion of the legislative branch. We're going to start with 6 learning objectives, and I'll read those to you now. Learning objective number 1. Describe the primary function and the institutional structure of the legislative branch. Learning objective number 2. Explain the paradoxical way that we feel about Congress. Learning objective number 3. Detail the process by which laws are created and explain why the framers made such a complicated system. Learning objective number 4. Distinguish between the various types and models of representation discussed in lecture. I will pause here and note that there are 2 types of representation that we are going to talk about: descriptive representation and substantive representation. And there are 2 major models of representative government: the trustee model and the delegate model. You need to be familiar with all of these, and you need to be able to compare and contrast them. This is especially important for learning objective number 5. So let's continue. The 5th learning objective asks for you to explain what types of representation Congress provides and how well. Finally, we're going to close with learning objective number 6, where you are asked to identify Mayhew's number 1 goal of the elected official, and I'll spoil that now. According to the seminal researcher, David Mayhew, the number 1 goal of all elected officials is, quite simply, to get reelected. And once you understand that all of our representatives are trying to get reelected, you can go a great deal of the way when it comes to predicting how they're going to behave or explaining their past behaviors. So keep that in the back of your mind, but we've gotten ahead of ourselves. Let's return briefly to learning objective number 1. Remember from previous lecture that the Constitution of the United States implements a process of separated powers. And what that means is that the 3 primary functions of government, legislating, administrating, and adjudicating, have been divorced. They have been divided and shared across 3 separate organs of government. The first of these 3 organs is the legislative branch. And the legislative branch is the portion of our federal government constitutionally charged by Article 1 with the creation of laws. To create a law is to legislate. So we call the legislative branch because, constitutionally speaking, its primary function is to create the laws. You can contrast this with the executive branch because Article 2 tells us that the executive branch shall administrate or execute and enforce the laws. You can also contrast the legislative branch with the judicial branch, which you're going to remember is identified by Article 3, and which in practice is there to resolve disputes about how to interpret or apply the law to particular cases. So these are the 3 branches of America's federal government. And recall from both our prior lecture and from your reading that the Constitution gives each of these 3 branches some tools that it can use to check the others and protect itself from oversteps by the other 2 branches. So, for example, Congress can check the President of the United States by refusing to introduce laws which are consistent with his particular platform. Congress also has the power to check the President by impeaching and subsequently convicting or removing him from office in certain extreme cases. Although that's never actually happened. We've had a few presidents now, including Donald Trump, who have been impeached or charged with a crime by a majority vote in the House. But to convict a president and then remove him, or maybe one day her, from office would require a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and that's never occurred before. So impeachment and subsequent removal from office really go a lot further in theory than they have historically gone in practice, but that's okay, because it may very well be that the mere threat of impeachment and removal from office is sufficient for Congress to check the executive branch in the event that our president ever oversteps his bounds. But Congress also has the power to check the judicial branch. And they can check the judicial branch in a couple of ways, but the most constitutional way for the legislative branch to check the judicial branch is to engage in what we call jurisdiction stripping. Jurisdiction stripping is when Congress uses its constitutional authority to take away the power of a court, usually the Supreme Court, to hear certain types of cases. And this has happened a couple of times throughout our nation's history, but we don't need to go into that now. Just understand that the legislative branch is there to create the laws and that it can check both the executive branch and the judicial branch in a number of different ways, clearly articulated by our Constitution. Now that we know what the legislative branch is and what it does, let's talk a little bit about how it's organized or structured as an institution. And in order to do that, the first thing that you need to be familiar with is this term that sounds a little strange, but isn't actually all that complicated: bicameralism. To be bicameral is to be two-chambered. So bicameralism is the division of our legislature into two distinct chambers. If you don't understand, in this context, the term chamber refers to a group or a body of elected officials. So Congress, or the legislature, or the legislative branch, is made up of two separate groups of individuals who have been elected to office. First, we have what's called the lower house, or the lower chamber, and that's going to be the House of Representatives. Then we're going to have the higher house, or the higher chamber, and that's going to be called the Senate. I want you to understand a couple of things about these. Most notably, that neither the House nor the Senate can ever create a law without the other's consent. In this sense, do understand that the Senate is not necessarily greater, even though it is sometimes called higher. It is higher in the sense that it has more prestige than the House of Representatives because it is more difficult to get in the Senate. But it is not greater in the sense of having more lawmaking authority because, once again, neither the House nor the Senate can ever create any law without the other's consent. So you could go through the House of Representatives, which has 435 members, and you could get 100% of that 435 to vote in favor of a new policy. Well, that bill would then go to the Senate, and the Senate would have an opportunity to decide whether it wants to pass the bill. And you might get 49 out of the 100 senators to support your bill, but in that case, having failed to get a majority of the Senate to approve the proposed policy, that bill is going to fail. Now keep in mind that if you got all 435 House members and 49 out of 100 senators, you got the majority of Congress as a whole. But that's not enough. You can't just get the majority of Congress as a whole. You've got to get the majority of first one chamber and then the majority of another chamber. In most cases, it doesn't matter which chamber you start with as long as you've gone through both chambers before the end of the process. But there is one exception to this general rule. And that helps us to talk a little bit about how the two chambers are distinct from one another, other than the fact that the Senate, being smaller, is harder to gain access to and is therefore more prestigious and in that sense higher. The first major difference between the House and Senate is that the House has what we call the power of the purse strings. The power of the purse strings is to introduce a bill, a proposed policy or law, which would raise taxes or revenue. And under our Constitution, all such bills have to start in the House. Now, they do eventually have to go through the Senate as well. Remember, the House cannot create a new law or policy without the Senate's consent. But the Senate doesn't have the power to propose new taxes. It can only approve or deny proposed taxes brought forward in the House of Representatives. So the House has the power of the purse strings, the power to introduce legislation, to introduce bills or proposed laws which would create more revenue. The Senate, by contrast, has no power of the purse strings, but it does have the power of advice and consent. The power of advice and consent is important because it basically means that when the president tries to enter into a treaty with a foreign government or nominate somebody to serve on a court or other federal position, well, he has to get his nominee or his proposed treaty approved by the Senate. And if the president is unable to do so, then that treaty will not be ratified into law. Then those nominees will not be seated on the court or in any other government office. So the Senate has a great deal of power in checking the president if he were to try and, let's say, stack or pack the United States Supreme Court with a number of very unqualified, unreasonable, or dangerous justices. So there is a division of labor, but the two chambers have co-equal lawmaking authority. Neither chamber can ever make a law without the other's consent, but the Senate is considered higher in that it is more prestigious. And it is more prestigious because there are fewer seats in the Senate, only 100 compared to 435 in the House. And when you have fewer seats in an elected body, then it is much, much, much more difficult to get into that elected body than it would be if there were more seats. But remember that our second learning objective asks for you to explain the paradoxical way that we feel about Congress. And this question requires us to talk about 3 sub-points, and the first of these is, how do we feel about Congress? Well, by and large, what I want you to understand is that we really, really, really hate Congress, that it is, in fact, the least popular portion of our entire federal government, with an approval rating that usually floats at around 15%. What does that mean? Well, if you say that we have a legislative body and that its approval rating is at 15%, what that means is that when you survey Americans and you ask them, overall, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Congress is doing, about 85% of them will say, I disapprove, and only about 15% of them will say, I approve. Just so you know, that means that more than 4 out of every 5 American citizens is not pleased with Congress. And this is puzzling because what we're going to find is that even though we hate Congress, we continuously re-elect congresspersons. So the second point to this second learning objective asks for you to explain why it is puzzling that we hate Congress. And the answer is that we elect Congress. Congress is simultaneously the most democratic and the least well-liked of all branches in our federal government. So now that we know how we feel about Congress and why this is puzzling, the next logical question to ask ourselves in order to satisfy this learning objective is, why? Why is it that we keep re-electing incumbents, people currently in office, if we don't like the job that Congress is doing? And the answer to this is really quite simple. We don't elect Congress as a whole. Instead, each state gets to elect its own senators, and each district within the states gets to elect its own representative. And by and large, what we're going to find is that people like their senator. People like their representative. But they do not like Congress as a whole. And the reason that we tend not to like Congress as a whole is that, first off, there's a great deal of gridlock, meaning that Congress isn't particularly efficient. A part of the reason why we have so much gridlock is that what we're going to find is that Republicans, a conservative group of individuals, and Democrats, a more liberal party, don't like to work together. But there's a much bigger portion in this puzzle, and a part of that has to do with, again, the fact that we don't have a nationwide popular vote for Congress as a whole. Remember, each member of the House of Representatives is going to be elected from a congressional district in a particular state. And each senator is going to be elected by the voters of his or her state. So if we're looking at Senators Langford or Inhofe, who represent Oklahoma in the higher chamber of Congress, then it's important to remember that they're going to do what Oklahomans want, because when they're up for re-election, they know that Oklahoman voters will have an opportunity to decide to either keep them in office or kick them out of office. Whereas people in Texas have no power over whether or not we retain Senators Langford or Inhofe. So neither Langford nor Inhofe is necessarily going to be concerned with what people want in Texas or what the country as a whole is desirous of. Their primary goal is to get reelected, and they know that in order to do that, they have to give the people of Oklahoma what they want. And that's what they're going to do in most cases. They're going to give us what we want in terms of how they present themselves. We like to have relatable leaders, and so leaders who are elected to represent conservative districts in Oklahoma are going to act like conservative Oklahomans. They're going to wear the same types of clothes, sometimes cowboy boots or even cowboy hats, and they're going to adopt issue positions as well as legislative missions that are popular in their constituencies. If you don't know, a constituent is a voter who is eligible to decide whether an elected leader remains in office or is kicked out of office. So if you live in Oklahoma, you are an Oklahoma constituent, meaning that you'll have an opportunity to vote on whether to keep Senators Langford and Inhofe when they are up for re-election or to replace them. So you are Inhofe's constituent, you are Langford's constituent. But if you live in Oklahoma, you are not one of Ocasio-Cortez's constituents because she is elected by and for the people of New York, not by and for the people of Oklahoma. That creates a lot of this gridlock that we find so frustrating because the voters in Oklahoma are going to send very, very conservative leaders, whereas folk over in New York or California are going to tend to send very liberal leaders. These liberal leaders are going to have one set of values that they are pushing for, whereas the conservative leaders from states like Texas or Oklahoma are going to have a very different set of often conflicting goals. Because all of the different legislators represent different people, they all have different goals and ideas about how to run our government, and that in turn means that government tends not to run very smoothly. But that's not entirely something that we can blame on the particular people in government. Because again, while partisan gridlock, a refusal of Republicans to work with Democrats or Democrats to work with Republicans, is certainly a growing issue in Congress, the problem really has a lot to do with the way that our legislative branch is designed. And in fact, it's worth noting that depending on who you ask, this lack of efficiency, this continuous gridlock and bickering that we observe in Congress might not be a problem at all. It might actually be a solution. Remember that one of the major principles in our Constitution is that of limited government, and that a part of limiting government is limiting its overall activity. In other words, to limit government is, in part, to prevent it from creating too many new laws. And one way that you can keep Congress from promoting too many new laws, which might take away our freedoms by doing things like telling us what we must do or what we cannot do, you can always try to turn Congress against itself. And that's a part of why we have a bicameral legislature. What we're going to find is that Congress is designed, that the process by which Congress takes a bill or proposed policy and turns it into law is designed to be slow and inefficient and to weed out the vast majority of proposed policies. So, for example, in the 115th Congress, that's the Congress that served from 2016 to 2018, we had about 442 out of 13,556 bills that actually passed into law. Now, one way that you can look at this and put a negative spin on it might be to say, look at all of these bills that they wasted time talking about only to kill. Remember that while laws do necessarily take away a certain degree of freedom, they don't exist for no reason. Every proposed law is proposed because it's going to help somebody or some group of voters solve a problem. And so a lot of the time we're going to see these bills, which we might love, being killed off by this process, and that can be aggravating. We can look at these numbers and say Congress isn't doing its job. They're wasting time. They haven't passed very many laws, but that's the duty with which they are constitutionally vested. However, you can also put a positive spin on these numbers because it's equally possible to say that we don't want 13,556 new laws every other year. It is also possible to say that the Congress has weeded out a whole bunch of potentially very bad proposals and only passed the absolute best policies. And it is possible to argue that this is a good thing for a variety of reasons. So before I go into the particular steps that every bill or proposed policy has to go through before it becomes a law, I do want you to understand that the framers wrote our Constitution and subsequent policies in such a way that creating new laws is very difficult. They made a system which is extremely rigorous, complicated, drawn out, and convoluted, and they did so for a couple of big reasons. First, they realized that by making this process so complicated, rigorous, and drawn out, they were creating ample opportunity for gridlock, and that this gridlock in turn would limit the overall activity of Congress. So the first reason that we have such a complicated, difficult system of lawmaking is that the framers wanted to limit the number of laws. The second reason that they created such a convoluted process was that by creating such a difficult and rigorous system, they ensured that Congress would weed out any policy that isn't very good. They didn't want just any old law to pass. They certainly didn't want 14,000 new laws every other year. The framers wanted only the best laws to pass. Now, to be clear, they did want some laws. They were not anarchists, but they thought that if we were going to live under a particular law, we needed to take steps to ensure that it was the very best law, that it was written exceptionally well so that it would achieve its goals, and that it was written with a great deal of support for the people and what they want or need from government. So, the process is difficult, first, to weed out bad bills. Second, to limit the overall level of activity in Congress. And finally, to promote public deliberation. What does that mean? Well, to deliberate is to talk. So public deliberation is when the public speaks with our elected leaders about how we would like for them to run our country. And what the framers realized is that if the process for making laws was too easy, if it was too streamlined, then each new law would be proposed and passed much too quickly for voters to really form an opinion, much less identify the bill, form an opinion, and then communicate that opinion to their leaders. So by making the process a bit longer and more drawn out, by creating ample opportunities for debate, the framers have promoted public deliberation, and that they draw out the process long enough for us, the American people, to learn about new proposals, to do our research, to hear both sides present their arguments, to decide which of these arguments we think is most compelling, and then to convey these convictions to our leaders so that they can, in turn, take our opinions into consideration when they decide whether or not to vote for a particular proposal. Those are the three major reasons that the process is so complicated. But our learning objective also requires that you be able to identify each of the individual steps, and really that's what this diagram is going to do for you. So the first step to having any new bill proposed in Congress is to get it formally introduced. Only a member of the House of Representatives can introduce a bill to the House of Representatives. Only a senator can introduce a bill to the Senate. And if you can't find at least one member of whichever chamber you would like to begin in to introduce your bill, well, then you're done. You failed to pass the first stage, and your bill was killed before its life had ever really begun. Now, let's say, for the sake of example, that we're going to deal with a tax bill. Remember that the House has the power of the purse strings, so in this case, we need to start in the House. And let's again say, for the sake of example, that I found at least one of the 435 representatives who likes my bill enough that he or she is willing to put his or her name on that bill. Once a member of the House or Senate has formally introduced a bill, that member becomes what we call the bill's author. That doesn't mean that he or she actually wrote the bill. In fact, quite frequently they borrow pre-written legislation from state legislators or from lobbying and other interest organizations. But when you have introduced a bill as a House rep or as a senator, you are what they refer to as that bill's author. Once you have your bill formally introduced, the author takes it to leadership, and the leadership refers it to a committee. A committee is a select subgroup of members chosen from the chamber at large for their special interest or expertise in a particular issue area. So, for example, there is an infrastructure committee that primarily focuses on making an initial assessment of all legislation dealing with things like roads, highways, or other infrastructure projects. And if you're an engineer, if you've got a background in construction or something to that nature, and then you get elected to Congress, there's a pretty good chance you'll wind up on the infrastructure committee because you've got a special expertise. Now, the function of the committee is to make an initial assessment of any bill. And this is where most proposed policies die, because a big part of what these committees are doing is what we call gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is when they use their position in the process to weed out really bad bills or to kill off redundant bills so that we can focus on only the most important and original ideas. The conference can, at this point, go ahead and kill the bill if the committee's chair doesn't want to hear it and therefore refuses to introduce it. But let's say, again, for the sake of our example, that the committee chair, once the bill has been referred to him or her, agrees to hear it. Well, in that case, the third step is for us to go into what we call committee markup. During committee markup, every member of the committee is given an opportunity to propose any changes that they would like to make to the bill. They can add language or they can take language away. Similarly, they can keep the existing language but make some changes or alterations. For example, let's say that the proposed tax policy we've introduced is a 1-cent tax on all grocery items, and the purpose here is to take 1 cent out of every dollar we spend shopping and send that to our teachers so that they can get a big pay raise. Well, it might be that I, as the author of this bill, the person who introduced it, think that this is a great policy, but perhaps I'm going to get to the committee and I'm going to discover that 1 penny per dollar spent on shopping items is not enough, it's not adequate to actually facilitate the pay raise that I would like. Well, then one of those experts on my committee can propose that we amend the bill so that instead of implementing a penny tax, we're going to implement a nickel tax. And we'll take 5 cents on every dollar, and then we'll use that 5 cents to pay off our teachers. Okay, so during committee markup, every single member has the opportunity to vote on whatever changes they would like to make. And technically, the bill is not at risk of being killed at this stage, but in practice, sometimes people find ways around that, because if you can get enough support on the committee, it's possible for you to, say, slip in a clause on a bill that you don't like, knowing that this clause will later on be used to kill it. One way or the other, once we're down to step 3, committee markup, during which every member of the committee gets to propose changes, we advance to a final vote of passage by the committee as a whole. At this stage, we've already decided what changes we're going to make in committee, and the job of the committee is to now vote on whether A, to kill the bill, or B, to move forward with the bill as amended by the committee. And in our example, we can say, for the sake of argument, that the committee has said, yes, let's move forward on this nickel tax. Again, remember, it's no longer a penny tax. That was killed and replaced with a nickel tax during committee markup. But if our nickel tax gets approved by the committee, the next step is for that bill to be taken by the author back to chamber leadership and then scheduled for a final reading, debate, and vote. Now, I do want you to understand that anyone who serves in the House of Representatives gets to play a role during the House reading and debate as well as the amendment process. So perhaps one of the members of the committee proposed a dime tax only to have their amendment rejected. Well, now he or she can introduce it again during the House reading, because during the House reading, every member of the chamber, including committee members, will get their opportunity to ask questions of the author, to propose or even author changes for the bill, and to try to get those changes passed either through the author's approval or by whipping up enough votes from other members of the chamber. Whatever the case, once both sides are satisfied with their arguments and all of the changes have been made, we go to a final vote of passage by the House as a whole. And if the House says no, if you don't get at least half of the 435 representatives to vote for your bill, the bill is dead, and everything up to this point has been a waste of time. However, if you can get at least 51% of the House of Representatives to vote for your bill, then we're still not done, because now we've got to go all the way back to the start, and we got to begin again by going through the same process on the other side of the Capitol complex over in the Senate. Now, remember that the Senate and the House have co-equal lawmaking authority, but they don't look the same. The House is much larger with 435 members, whereas the Senate is much smaller with only 100 members. So the types of priorities that the Senate brings forward when it's introducing legislation aren't always the same as the types of priorities that the much larger House brings forward. And as a result, we're going to sometimes run into a problem wherein the House will send a bill to the Senate, and the Senate will amend that bill, then send it back to the House, and then the House will undo those amendments and send it back to the Senate. This is what we call legislative ping pong, and it occurs because once the House has approved a bill, that bill goes to the Senate and has to go through the same process. But remember, at various steps along the way, including committee markup and the reading and debate of the bill, senators will have an opportunity to propose changes. So perhaps in committee, one of our members decided that a nickel tax was still not good enough and that what we really needed was a dime tax. So they will vote, and let's say they pass that. Okay, well, now our nickel tax approved by the House is done, and we've got a dime tax. Let's say that this dime tax then makes it to the Senate and is approved. Now we've got a peculiar situation where the House has passed one policy, a nickel tax, and the Senate has passed another policy, a dime tax. Those two things aren't compatible, so we have to reconcile differences between the two bills. Historically, we've done that again through legislative ping pong by batting the bills back and forth between the House and Senate, changing and unchanging the bill until one side finally caves and we get what we want. This process was extremely inefficient, and because of this inefficiency, we've come up with a new solution that we refer to as the Conference Committee. The Conference Committee is a temporary committee made up of members selected from both the House and the Senate, which convenes in order to resolve the different versions of the same bill that passed the House and Senate. In other words, the Conference Committee is a final committee, and their job is to reconcile differences between the House and Senate versions of a bill, to make final changes and submit a final revision of that bill to both chambers. Once the conference committee has made its changes, no further alterations to the bill can be made, and each chamber is basically asked to pass the bill as amended by the conference committee or not at all. So this becomes somewhat of a problem in certain cases, because it opens the door to what is sometimes called a pork project or a pork barrel project. Members of the conference committee can add additional language, requisites, or other such projects into the language of a bill, and basically use that as a way to achieve electoral goals, even if their added language doesn't help to facilitate the central function for which the bill was made. Typically, pork or pork projects involve funding programs whose economic benefits are concentrated in a particular area, but whose costs are spread among all taxpayers. So, for example, if I were a California representative and the voters in my district wanted a new bridge, I could wait until conference committee, ask to be placed on that conference committee, and then add to a bill dealing with, let's say, disaster relief on the East Coast, a clause which authorizes funds to build that bridge in my district. The voters in my district will benefit, but the country as a whole probably doesn't have much interest in that project, and in addition to that, it has absolutely nothing to do with the central focus of the bill, disaster relief on the entire other side of the country. But it is to my best interest to get a bridge for my voters because, again, David Mayhew's #1 goal, I'm trying to get reelected. One way or the other, if the conference committee's bill is approved by both the House and the Senate, not one or the other, but both, the next stage is for the bill to be sent to the president's office. Now, in most cases, once a bill hits the president's desk, he's just going to sign it. But if the president does not like a bill, he, or maybe one day she, can veto the bill, and then the bill is essentially done. However, in certain cases, a veto can be overridden by a 2/3 majority of both the House and the Senate. Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to get 2/3 of either chamber to agree on anything, much less to get 2/3 of both chambers. And in most cases, if the president sees that you have 2/3 of both chambers, he won't even bother vetoing the bill because he'll know that that bill is just going to get passed with an override of the veto, which would make him look weak. So, generally speaking, in 99 out of 100 cases, if the president vetoes a bill, that bill is simply dead. And all of our work getting the bill or proposed policy through all of these stages has essentially been a waste of time. So when we look and find that only about 450 out of every 13,550 bills proposed passes, well, remember, that's because this is a very difficult, convoluted process, and your bill has to survive every single step along the way. In each of these stages, a proposed policy can be killed. And it's not enough to get through 90% of this process or 98% of this process. You've got to get through the entire process. And if you don't, then your bill has been killed. And that's not because congresspersons are incompetent or lazy. That might be true, but at the end of the day, the process is designed to weed out the majority of bills as a way of limiting government activity and ensuring that only the best, most popular, and well thought out legislation actually passes into law. Okay. So the next big question that we're going to have to ask ourselves has to do with Congress's secondary function, and that secondary function is to provide representation. So yes, we want Congress to create the laws, but not just any old laws. We want Congress to create laws which represent what we want and need from our government. The problem that we run into here is that different congresspersons in the House and Senate have different ideas of what it means to provide representation, and different people have different understandings of how representative government is supposed to work. Let's start with the two different understandings of what it means for a legislator to represent his or her constituents. The first and most traditional understanding of representation is what we sometimes call substantive representation. Substantive representation is representing the political wants, needs, and interests of constituents by introducing and campaigning for their policy preferences. A substantively representative system, then, gives the people a voice in government. In other words, substantive representation is government for the people. You can contrast this with descriptive representation, which is sometimes thought of or conceptualized as government by the people. If substantive representation gives us a voice in government, descriptive representation gives us a face in government. But to help solidify these concepts, let's move on to another definition. Descriptive representation might be defined as representing constituents by mirroring their personal, politically relevant characteristics. So a descriptively representative system provides the people with a face in government, meaning that the people in government will have similar demographic backgrounds, distributions, and socioeconomic backgrounds when you compare them to the folks that they represent. So, for example, about 50% of the American population is male, and about 50% of the American population is female. If Congress were descriptively representative, we would expect to see about half of all congresspersons as men, and half of all congresspersons are women. The reality, however, is that Congress does not do a very good job of providing descriptive representation, at least not as compared to where many of us would like for them to be. It is worth noting that we have the most diverse Congress that we've ever had, that it is better at providing the general public with descriptive representation, but as the statistics on your slide show, there's still a lot of room for progress, and this is especially true when we're looking at the overall income of people in Congress. About half of all of the people across the House and Senate are going to make at least $1 million per year. And that means that they are overrepresenting the rich and underrepresenting the poor in descriptive terms. Similarly, while we have more women than we've ever had in Congress before, 75% of all elected officials in the legislative branch are still men, compared to a little less than 50% in the general public. So, on the whole, Congress doesn't provide very good descriptive representation, and there are a couple of reasons why this might be problematic. The first reason it might be problematic, according to proponents of descriptive representation, is that it could potentially send a message to, say, young women and minority children, telling them that government and leadership are the domain of whites or of men. If you're a young girl and you've never seen a woman in a leadership role, that might shape how you feel about yourself and how you think about your proper place in the world. Now, again, we don't know that this is true, but it is possible, it does sound plausible, and many very intelligent people have made this argument. It's hard to test empirically, but it is a concern. Another reason why we might be concerned with the general lack of descriptive representation is that there is some mixed evidence to indicate that when descriptive representation increases, so does substantive representation. Now again, we're not 100% sure that this is true. The research in this area has been fairly ambiguous. Some have suggested that descriptive representation does promote substantive representation, whereas others have suggested that it doesn't really make much of a difference. Why might it make a difference? Well, the argument goes that if you are, let's say, a woman, then you are naturally more in touch with the day-to-day realities and problems facing other women, having lived it yourself. Whereas if you're a man, you're not as in touch with the wants of those voters, and therefore, you're not as prepared to give them policies from which they will benefit. And that does sound plausible. But there are some people who say that the general lack of descriptive representation isn't that big of a deal and that it shouldn't concern us because we can have substantive representation even without descriptive representation, and therefore descriptive representation doesn't really matter. Their argument is that I don't really care whether I share the same skin color with an elected official. I don't really care if the elected official has the same genitalia as I do. What really matters are the types of policies that he or she is going to pass. It is possible for a man to create policies from which women benefit, or for a woman to create policies from which women are harmed. But you're not going to decide to vote for the woman who is creating policies which hurt women just because you yourself are a woman. If you are asked to choose between somebody who has the same skin color as you but proposes very bad policies and somebody who has a different skin color than your own but proposes very good policy, most of us will choose the latter. We would rather vote for somebody who is going to give us substantive representation but who doesn't provide descriptive representation and that he or she doesn't look like us in most cases. So what we're going to find then is that statistically speaking, and based on the existing research, Congress doesn't provide very good descriptive representation because it doesn't have to. We're generally willing to vote for people who don't have the same skin color or gender as ourselves as long as they give us substantive representation. But if they aren't passing policies from which we benefit, and if they aren't passing policies that we like and support, then we won't support them. Consequently, remember David Mayhew's #1 goal. All elected officials want to get reelected. So they're going to provide substantive representation because they recognize that if they don't, they're going to get kicked out of office. Male legislators have to pass policies from which females in the general public are going to benefit because, well, here's the thing. Women make up a majority of voters in our country. Women vote much more reliably than men, and so you can't ignore their interests if you want to stay in office, even if you yourself are a man. So Congress, generally speaking, seems to provide fairly good substantive representation, but it does not, generally speaking, seem to provide very good descriptive representation. All right, let's go ahead and close with the trustee versus delegate models of representative government. Substantive and descriptive representation describe the different ways in which we can define representation and what it means to represent voters. However, these two terms, the trustee model of government and the delegate model of government, each describe competing models or ideas about how a representative government should operate as a whole and how the individual elected officials inside of that government should act. Let's start with the delegate model of representation because that's the most classic understanding of how democratic government ought to work and operate. In the delegate model of representation, we have a model of government where decision makers, elected officials, serve as what we call instructed delegates. An instructed delegate is a legislator who acts as a middleman or agent for voters and makes policies according to the wishes of those voters without regards to his or her own preferences. In other words, an instructed delegate is an individual legislator who gives the voters what they want, even if he disagrees with it. So, if you are a pro-choice person, but you are elected to represent pro-life people, the delegate model tells us that you should vote pro-life. Now, maybe that conflicts with your own values. Maybe you think that that's a bad policy, but under the delegate model, your preferences don't matter. It's the preferences of the people that are actually important. So, by and large, pander to public opinion. Give the people what they want and stop trying to figure out what you think is in their best interest or what you think is right. The delegate model tends to be favored by people who are generally distrustful of political leaders and people in the political class, but it's not the only approach to representative government that we need to talk about. There's also what we call the trustee model of representation, and this is a model of representative government in which elected officials serve as trustees. A trustee is a legislator who acts according to his or her own expert judgment and personal convictions in order to promote the broader interest of their voters. So do note that in both the trustee model of representation and the delegate model of representation, our elected leaders are supposed to show concerns for the people. But in the delegate model, they're going to show a concern for what the people want. In the trustee model, they're going to show a concern for what they think the people need. The trustee model of government tends to be preferred by people who don't trust the general public, who find the average voter uninformed or inadequately prepared to make sound decisions about what sorts of policies will benefit our country or even the people within our country. So the trustee is going to point out that quite frequently the typical voter doesn't know what's in his or her own best interest, because most of us honestly don't have the information or mental faculty necessary to gather that information. And our elected officials, the argument goes, are much, much better situated for this purpose. We elect people because we trust them to exercise sound judgment, and we're going to defer to their wisdom. If they exercise poor judgment, their policies will over time hurt us, and we vote them out of office. But they should not pander to public opinion under the trustee model. Because remember, the trustee model says that we need to trust the people in government to know what's in our own best interest and to give us what we need, even if it's not popular at that time. But there is concern, because while the trustee model proponents are probably correct to say that we don't always know what's in our best interest, the same might be said of political leaders. They might be out of touch. Remember that lack of descriptive representation. So the bottom line here is that there are arguments for and against both of these models, but I'm not going to tell you where to stand. What I do want you to understand, however, is where we actually are. Do keep in mind that the trustee model of government and the delegate model of government are both theories about how the government ought to be, but neither is an accurate representation of how representative government in our country actually is, because in reality, remember, David Mayhew's #1 goal tells us that all elected officials are trying to get reelected. And most elected officials recognize that if they want to achieve that goal and get reelected, it's not enough to always be a delegate or always be a trustee. If you always serve as a delegate and give the people what they want, even when you know it's going to hurt them, then those policies are going to backfire. They're going to cause damage, say, to the economy, and then those voters are going to hold you accountable. We're not going to take responsibility. Sure, we're the ones who told you to do that, but remember, we elected you, our leader, to exercise expert judgment on our behalf, and you failed to do so. So if you don't give the people what they need, if you always just pander to public opinion, eventually people are going to boot you out. They're also going to accuse you of flip-flopping, because here's another thing about public opinion. It fluctuates very rapidly. On the flip side, if you always act as a trustee and you always do what you think is best at the expense of what the people think is best, in the short term, again, you're going to get kicked out of office. So, for example, here in Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District, we are represented by an individual named Markwayne Mullen. And Markwayne Mullen, not surprisingly, exhibits a very conservative profile if you look at his voting history, because he represents one of the, if not the, most conservative districts in Oklahoma, which is itself a very conservative state. But if we said, for the sake of example, that tomorrow Congressman Mullen voted to create tax funding for abortion and to ban firearms, we can go ahead and bet that he's going to get voted out of office. Even if he thought, he doesn't, but even if he thought that these things were in the best interest of our country, he would never vote for them, because he knows that his voters would hold him accountable. And the #1 goal is to get reelected. So the bottom line here is that in reality, politicians walk a tightrope. They have to balance acting as a delegate, giving us what we want, and acting as a trustee, giving us what we need. And that's usually the reality of our government. All right, that's the end of this week's lecture. So make sure you complete all of your graded assignments, and I'll see you next week.